For 30 years, my husband hid his bank account from me. After his death, a banker called me with a trembling voice. "Ma'am, you need to come in urgently." When the banker opened the folder and told me the balance, my hands started shaking. Good day, dear listeners. It's Larissa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I have spent a great deal of time sitting at my kitchen table since Harold died, drinking coffee that goes cold before I remember to finish it, looking at the chair where he used to sit every morning with his newspaper folded in quarters. 31 years is a long time to share a kitchen with someone, long enough that the absence of a person becomes its own kind of presence, a negative space shaped exactly like the man you lost. Harold Eugene Calloway. He was 68 years old when his heart stopped, quietly, in his sleep, on a Tuesday in October. The doctors said it was peaceful. I have chosen to believe them because the alternative, that he was afraid, that he reached for me in the dark and I didn't wake, is not something I am able to carry. We met at a church potluck in 1993. I was 42, recently divorced, raising my son Thomas alone in a 2-bedroom house on Sycamore Lane. Harold was 40, a widower with a 12-year-old daughter named Diane. He brought a green bean casserole that was, frankly, terrible, but he laughed at my joke about it, and that was that. We were not a glamorous couple. Harold worked in municipal water management for the city of Cincinnati for 26 years. I was a school librarian. We drove sensible cars, took one vacation a year, usually somewhere in driving distance, Gatlinburg or Traverse City, and ate dinner at 6 o'clock every evening. On Sundays, we went to church. On Friday nights, we watched old movies. It was a quiet life, and I loved it without reservation. Looking back now, I can identify the moments that should have made me ask questions. Small things, the kind of things a trusting wife explains away without effort. Harold managed our finances entirely. I had never thought to question this. It was simply the arrangement we fell into, and I was grateful, honestly, not to think about it. He paid the bills, he handled the taxes. When I asked about our retirement savings, he would say, "We're comfortable, Peg, don't worry." And I didn't worry. I trusted him. That was the foundation of 30 years. But there were moments. Once, about 6 years ago, I found a bank statement on his desk, just the edge of it sticking out from under a car magazine. I didn't touch it. I can't tell you why. Something in the way it was half hidden made me feel, instinctively, that looking would be an intrusion. I smoothed the magazine over it and went back to the kitchen. I have thought about that moment many times since October. There were phone calls he took in the garage. Not often, maybe once every few months. He would say it was his brother Dale, or a former colleague, and I accepted that. Harold was a private man. I respected his privacy. Diane, his daughter, came to visit 4 or 5 times a year. She lived in Columbus with her husband Kevin, a man with a contractor's handshake and eyes that were always calculating something. I had never warmed to Kevin. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Diane was difficult in the way that daughters of widowers often are. She had been the woman of her father's house before I arrived, and she never entirely forgave me for changing that. But we maintained a civil surface for Harold's sake. At the funeral, Diane cried loudly and held Harold's photograph for a long time. Kevin stood slightly apart, and I noticed, though I noted it without understanding it, that he spent a portion of the reception speaking quietly on his phone near the coat closet. I was too deep in grief to wonder what that was about. 3 weeks after we buried Harold, on a gray November morning, my telephone rang. The number on the screen showed First Federal Trust, Harold's bank, the one where we held our joint checking account. The man who spoke identified himself as Mr. Gerald Okafor, Senior Accounts Manager. His voice was careful, measured, but underneath the professional tone, there was something else. A quality I can only describe as unsteadiness, as though he were choosing each word with the awareness that it was fragile. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I apologize for disturbing you during this time, but there is a matter connected to your late husband's accounts that requires your attention in person. I want to be transparent with you. It is a significant matter. Would you be able to come into the branch at your earliest convenience?" I asked him if he could tell me more over the phone. There was a pause. "I think," he said quietly, "it would be better if you came in." I wrote down the appointment time with a hand that had already, without my permission, begun to tremble. The First Federal Trust Branch on Montgomery Road was a place I had been perhaps a dozen times in 30 years. Harold handled the banking. I knew this the way I knew the route to the dentist. Functional familiarity, nothing more. I parked in the lot and sat in the car for a moment, watching a young mother struggle with a stroller near the entrance, and I thought, whatever this is, it is probably nothing dramatic. Probably a pension form. Probably paperwork. I was trying to protect myself. I see that now. Mr. Gerald Okafor was a trim man in his mid-50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the manner of someone who had delivered difficult news before, but had not grown comfortable with it. He met me in the lobby and led me to a private office, not an open desk, a proper room with a door that he closed behind us. That was the first indication that this was not about a pension form. He offered me water. I accepted. He opened a folder on the desk between us, and I noticed that his hands were not entirely steady. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I want to begin by saying that your husband was a long-standing client of this institution and was always in good standing. What I'm about to show you is not a matter of any irregularity on his part, legally speaking." He paused on those last two words in a way that made them ring. "Your husband maintained an individual savings account at this branch, separate from your joint checking, for approximately 22 years. I heard the words. I arranged them in order. I understood them grammatically before I understood them in any human sense. He opened it in 2002, Mr. Okafor continued. It was funded through regular transfers from a secondary income source. Consulting work, it appears, connected to his municipal position. Private infrastructure advising, all declared, all legal." He cleared his throat. "Over the course of those 22 years, with compound interest and conservative investment vehicles attached to the account, the balance has grown substantially." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. I looked at the number. My hands began to shake. Not from cold, not from fear, but from something more fundamental. The kind of trembling that happens when the ground beneath a thing shifts. The balance was $847,000. I sat with that number for what felt like a very long time. In reality, it was probably 45 seconds. Mr. Okafor did not speak. He had the grace to let the silence exist. $847,000 in an account I did not know existed. Accumulated across 22 years of a marriage I had believed I understood entirely. I drove home on autopilot. I sat at the kitchen table, Harold's chair empty across from me, and I did the arithmetic of betrayal, not legal betrayal. Mr. Okafor had been careful to say it. Legally speaking, there was no irregularity. Harold had earned the consulting income. He had declared it. The account was in his name alone, which was his legal right. Nothing he had done was illegal. But 22 years of silence. 22 years of, "We're comfortable, Peg, don't worry." 22 years of letting me believe our finances were simple, shared, fully visible, while he built, quietly and deliberately, a separate financial world. Why? That was the question that circled and circled. Was he planning to leave me? Was he afraid of something? Was it simply control? The need to possess something I couldn't touch? I would never get to ask him. That was perhaps the cruelest part. Then I thought of Diane. The phone call Kevin had taken at the reception. The way Diane had, in the weeks since Harold's death, asked, more than once, and with a specificity that I now reconsidered, whether I had sorted out all of Harold's paperwork, whether I had been in touch with the bank, whether I needed any help with the estate. Had she known? Had Harold told his daughter what he had hidden from his wife? I went to Harold's filing cabinet, the locked one in the study, for which I had found the key in his desk drawer the week after he died. I had looked through it once, briefly, feeling like an intruder. Now I looked again, more carefully. The will was there, in a manila envelope. Harold's will, drawn up. The date surprised me. Only 3 years ago. I had not read it before. I had assumed, the way a person assumes in a long marriage, that I knew its contents. I read it now. The house was mine. Our joint checking account was mine. Harold's pension survivor benefits were mine. The individual savings account, listed explicitly by account number, was to be divided equally between Diane Calloway Mercer and Kevin Mercer, his daughter and her husband, not his wife. I set the document down on Harold's desk and looked at the framed photograph beside the lamp. Harold and I at Niagara Falls, 1998. Both of us laughing at something that had already left my memory. And I made a decision, sitting in that quiet study, that I was not going to accept this without understanding it fully. Whatever Harold had intended, whatever Diane and Kevin already knew, I was going to find out. And I was going to take every legal step available to me. I was 72 years old. I was a widow. And I was not, as it turned out, done. The attorney's name was Patricia Wells, a colleague from my library days. Her husband had served on the library board, had recommended her without hesitation. She is not warm, my friend Dorothy had said over the phone, but she is precise. And when you need an attorney, precise matters more than warm. Patricia Wells operated out of a second-floor office on Erie Avenue, the kind that announces competence without ornamentation. Law books flush with the shelves, diplomas framed squarely, a desk clear of everything except the matter at hand. She was perhaps 60, with short silver hair and the listening posture of someone who had trained herself not to react to anything until she had heard all of it. I laid everything on her desk. The bank statement Mr. Okafor had provided. The will. My 31 years of marriage, compressed into a timeline. I told her about Diane's questions at the estate, Kevin's phone call at the reception, the consulting income I had never been told about. Patricia listened without interrupting. Then she asked 3 questions. How long ago had the will been revised? Had I been present or consulted when it was drawn up? And did I know the name of the attorney who had prepared it? I knew the answer to the first, 3 years ago. The second, no, I had not known it was being revised. The third, the attorney's name was printed on the document. Robert Lyle, of Lyle and Associates, a firm I had never heard of. Patricia made a note. Then she folded her hands. Mrs. Calloway, she said, I want to be straightforward with you. Ohio is not a community property state, which means your husband was legally entitled to maintain separate assets in his name only. However, she paused. A surviving spouse in Ohio has what is called an elective share, a statutory right to a portion of the augmented estate, regardless of what the will specifies. You were married for 31 years. You have a strong basis to claim your elective share of that account. She explained the process calmly. We would file a notice of election with the probate court. This would put the estate on hold. It would also, she noted, become a matter of record, visible to all interested parties. Diane and her husband will know almost immediately, she said. It was not a warning, exactly, more an acknowledgement of weather. I understand, I said. What I did not say was that I half wanted them to know. That some part of me, the part that had sat at Harold's desk looking at Niagara Falls, was already tired of being managed. I signed the initial retainer on a Wednesday. By the following Monday, I noticed a change. Diane called twice that week, which was unusual. The calls were warm, warmer than our normal register, and filled with questions phrased as concern. How are you sleeping, Peggy? Are you eating? Thomas hasn't been pressuring you about anything, has he? My son, Thomas, I noted, was invoked as a potential threat rather than a comfort. It was a subtle thing, but I had been a librarian for 30 years. I had learned to read subtext. Kevin texted, Kevin, who had not texted me independently in the entirety of our acquaintance, to say he and Diane were thinking of me and hoped I was not overwhelmed with decisions right now. They knew I had visited an attorney. I don't know how they knew. Perhaps they had a contact at the probate court. Perhaps someone had seen my car on Erie Avenue. In a city the size of Cincinnati, information moves in ways you don't always trace. What mattered was the behavior change. Meanwhile, Patricia had been making inquiries. She called me on the Thursday of the second week. Her voice carried its usual precision, but there was a new quality beneath it, the particular energy of someone who has found what they were looking for. I've pulled the probate file on the will, she said. The witnesses to Harold's signature, both of them, are employees of Lyle and Associates. That's standard, and not itself unusual. A pause. What is less standard is that I've spoken with Dr. Ewan, who was Harold's primary care physician. According to his records, Harold was diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia 14 months before the will was revised. The room went very still. His capacity at the time of signing is, to put it plainly, questionable, Patricia said. Robert Lyle would have been obligated to conduct a capacity assessment. I've requested that documentation. If it's absent or inadequate, we have grounds for a challenge on the basis of testamentary capacity. I sat with the telephone pressed against my ear and thought, Harold, who told you to change the will? Was it your idea or theirs? There is one more thing, Patricia said. I've been in contact with a former associate of Lyle's firm who left under disputed circumstances 2 years ago. She has indicated she may be willing to speak with us. Informally, for now. What did she say? I asked. She said, Patricia replied, that Kevin Mercer was present at the office on the day Harold signed. The filing happened on a Tuesday morning in December, gray and cold. The kind of Ohio winter day that makes the world look like it has been photocopied one too many times. Patricia and I met at the probate court on Main Street, and I watched her hand the documents to the clerk with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times. I had dressed carefully, not for them exactly, but for myself. I wore the blue wool coat I had bought with Harold on a trip to Chicago 7 years ago. I don't know why that felt important. Perhaps because I needed to be held together by something. The elective share notice was filed. The capacity challenge documentation was submitted alongside it, supported by Dr. Ewan's medical records and a preliminary affidavit from Patricia's contact, the former Lyle associate, whose name was Sandra Chu, attesting that she had witnessed Kevin Mercer accompanying Harold into the attorney's office on the day the revised will was executed. We had not yet subpoenaed Robert Lyle. Patricia wanted to preserve that for the appropriate moment, but we had enough to halt the estate's distribution and open a formal inquiry. By Thursday of that week, my phone rang with a Columbus area code. It was not Diane, it was Kevin. He did not begin with pleasantries. His voice had dropped the contractor's affability entirely, and what remained was something flatter and more deliberate. "Peggy," he said, "I think we need to have an honest conversation." "I agree," I said. I was standing in my kitchen. I made myself stay standing. He told me, with measured patience, that what I was doing was hurtful to Diane, that Harold had made his wishes clear, and that those wishes deserved to be respected, that contesting a will was an adversarial act, and that the family— he used the word family with a familiarity I found remarkable, given that he had never once included me in it— deserved better. Then the tone shifted. "I want you to understand," he said, "that a competency challenge works both ways. If there's a question about Harold's state of mind, there may also be questions raised about the decisions you've been making since his death. Grief affects people. It can look a lot like impaired judgment." I understood him perfectly. He was telling me that if I pursued this, he would attempt to have me declared mentally unfit. He would try to move the lens from Harold's capacity to mine. "Kevin," I said, "I appreciate you being direct. I'll be direct in return. I have retained counsel. All further communication should go through her. Her contact information is on the notice of election you've already received." A silence. "Peggy!" "Goodbye, Kevin." I hung up. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. 2 days later, Diane appeared at my door. She was alone, which was unusual, and she looked as though she had slept badly. She came inside because I let her in. I am not entirely certain why, except that 30 years of being a stepmother, however imperfect, had left some residue of instinct. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table. She cried. Genuinely, I think. Or at least the tears were connected to something real, even if the strategy around them was calculated. She told me I was destroying her father's memory, that Harold had his reasons for what he did, and that I was being paranoid, that Kevin had only meant to protect the family. "He threatened to have me declared incompetent," I said. She flinched, just slightly. "He was upset," she said. "He didn't mean it." "Your attorney should speak with my attorney," I said. She left without resolution. I stood at the window and watched her car back out of the driveway, and I felt the particular fatigue that comes not from physical exertion, but from sustained vigilance, the exhaustion of having been alert for a very long time. I called my son Thomas that evening. He lived in Portland now, and I had not told him everything yet. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mom, I'm coming." "You don't have to," I said. "I'm coming," he said again. I took 3 days. I did not call Patricia. I did not think about Kevin or Diane or probate courts. I cooked things I had not cooked in months. Thomas arrived on Friday night, and we watched old movies, Harold's tradition, which turned out to belong to me now too. And I let myself be still, but only 3 days. Then I called Patricia and told her I was ready to continue. The settlement offer arrived in the first week of January, delivered via letter from a Columbus law firm retained by Kevin and Diane. I recognized the architecture of it immediately. It was designed to look generous while being, in fact, a means of closing the matter before it could open further. They offered $120,000, a seventh of the account's value. Structured as a goodwill distribution in recognition of Mrs. Calloway's spousal contributions, which was a careful way of offering money without admitting the estate owed it to me. The letter included language about the emotional and financial costs of continued litigation and expressed a hope that the matter could be resolved with dignity. I noticed that dignity was only invoked in reference to my stopping. It was not invoked in reference to their conduct. I brought the letter to Patricia on a Wednesday afternoon. She read it without expression and set it on her desk. "They're worried," she said. "I know," I said. "What do you want to do?" I had thought about it for several days. I had sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and thought about $120,000, which was, by any reasonable measure, more money than I had expected to receive. I thought about how much easier it would be to take it and return to the quiet. To let the kitchen chair remain empty and uncomplicated. But then I thought about Harold signing documents in a law office while Kevin sat somewhere in the building. Harold, whose mind had already begun, quietly and without his knowledge, to slip. Harold, who had perhaps been told what to sign or made to feel it was reasonable by the man his daughter had married. Was the secret account Harold's own choice? Perhaps. Or perhaps in his last years, someone had been steering. "I want to decline," I said. Patricia nodded once, as though this were the answer she had expected. The response letter went out that afternoon. Polite. Definitive. The matter would proceed through the court. After that, for approximately 2 weeks, Kevin and Diane went quiet. No calls, no visits, no letters beyond the formal exchange between attorneys. Thomas, who had extended his stay in Cincinnati, said it felt like the calm before something. I agreed, but I chose not to borrow trouble from the future. Instead, I leaned into the present. Dorothy, my oldest friend from the library years, had been urging me for months to attend the grief support group at our church. Not the maudlin kind, she insisted, but a practical one, facilitated by a retired social worker named Helen, who had no patience for self-pity and a great deal of patience for honesty. I finally went on a Thursday evening in January. There were 8 of us in the circle that night. Most were widows and widowers. A retired postal worker named Frank, who had lost his wife to cancer. A woman named Cecilia, who was perhaps 80, with the straight posture of someone who had decided not to yield to anything. Helen, the facilitator, who had steel gray hair and a directness I immediately respected. I did not tell them about the will or the account. I talked instead about the sensation of grief I hadn't anticipated. Not sadness exactly, but vertigo. The loss of the version of the marriage I had believed in. The difficulty of mourning someone you were also, in some private compartment, angry at. Helen looked at me for a moment after I finished. "Grief and anger can share the same house," she said. "The trouble comes when people think one of them has to leave before the other is allowed in." I drove home in the cold January dark and felt, for the first time in months, slightly less alone. Thomas had dinner ready when I arrived. He was a decent cook, which surprised me every time. We ate and talked about his work and his daughter's school play, and for an hour the house felt full again in the way it is only full when there is another person in it who loves you without agenda. This, I thought, this is what I'm protecting. Not the money, or not only the money. The right to have been a real part of Harold's life. The right not to have been managed and minimized and quietly excluded. The right to know what was true. I was ready for whatever came next. They came on a Saturday in late January, unannounced, which was itself a statement of intention. Kevin's car pulled into the driveway at 10:30 in the morning, and I watched from the kitchen window as they both got out. Diane with a covered dish, which was such an obvious prop that I nearly smiled. They had coordinated this. The covered dish, the unannounced arrival, the Saturday morning, all of it chosen to suggest spontaneity while being anything but. I had been a school librarian for 30 years. I knew the difference between a natural visit and a staged one. Thomas had gone to the grocery store. I was alone. I let them in. I want to be clear that this was a choice, not a failure of nerve. I wanted to hear what they would say when they believed they had me at a disadvantage. I wanted to see what they looked like when they thought they were winning. Diane set the dish on the counter, a casserole of some kind, still warm, and hugged me with the practiced sincerity of someone who has decided that warmth is a tactic. Kevin shook my hand and said I looked well. His eyes assessed the house with the efficiency of someone calculating its contents. I noticed him glance at the bookcase, the mantel, the photograph of Harold and me at Niagara Falls. He was doing arithmetic of some kind. We sat in the living room. Diane did most of the talking at first, and she was good at it. I'll allow her that. She spoke about how much her father had loved me, about how none of this was what any of them had wanted, about how she hoped we could find a way through that honored Harold's memory. She held a tissue that she did not quite use. Kevin nodded at intervals, performing the role of reasonable husband, a role he had, I suspected, rehearsed during the drive from Columbus. Then, and the transition was smooth enough that someone less watchful might have missed it, the conversation shifted. Kevin leaned forward slightly and said that he wanted to be honest with me about a few things. He said that the legal process I had set in motion would take months, possibly longer, that it would be costly, my costs as well as theirs, that courts in Ohio were unpredictable and that capacity challenges were difficult to prove, and that what Patricia Wells was offering me was hope, not certainty. He named a figure, the approximate cost of sustained probate litigation, with the casual authority of someone who had looked it up the night before. "Peggy," he said, "you're 72 years old. Do you really want to spend the next year of your life in a courtroom?" I looked at him. I said nothing. He continued. He said that Dr. Ewan's records were already 3 years old, that Harold had been fully functional in daily life, drove himself, managed his household, made his own decisions, that Sandra Chu, Patricia's witness, had a history of grievances with Robert Lyle's firm and was not a reliable source. "She has an axe to grind," he said, as though the phrase were devastating. That they had already consulted 2 additional attorneys who had affirmed the will's validity, and that those opinions would be submitted to the court. He laid out each point patiently, the way you dismantle something piece by piece. The casserole on the counter, the reasonable tone, the careful, systematic dismantling of every piece of my case, delivered in a living room where Harold's photograph still sat on the mantel. And through all of it, I felt something interesting. I felt calm. Not the false calm of someone suppressing panic, but something more genuine. The steadiness that comes from having already decided, from knowing your own ground. Then Diane spoke again, and her voice had changed. The warmth was thinner now, something harder and less patient beneath it. "We don't want this to become something ugly," she said. "But if it does, if you keep pushing, there will be things that come out about the marriage that might be difficult for you. Things that paint a different picture than the one you have." I felt the air in the room change. "What things?" I asked. My voice was even. She hesitated. Kevin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a small tell, the only one he had shown. "Harold confided in Diane," he said. "There were difficulties in the marriage, periods of significant strain. There were conversations Harold had with Diane that he never had with you. If this goes to court and character becomes relevant, if the nature of the marriage becomes part of the record." "Kevin," I said, "you are sitting in my house, in the room where Harold and I spent 30 years, and you are threatening to fabricate difficulties in my marriage to a man who cannot speak for himself." I looked at him without blinking. "I want you to leave, both of you, now." A silence settled over the room. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a car passed on the street. Kevin stood first. The reasonable husband performance dissolved entirely, and what remained beneath it was simply cold fury. The anger of someone accustomed to getting what he wants, who has just encountered an obstacle he underestimated. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up his keys from the side table where he had placed them when he arrived. Diane stood after him. She looked, for a brief and unguarded moment, like she might say something genuine. Like the real person beneath the strategy was about to surface, worn thin by the weight of what they were doing. I watched her face. But she looked at Kevin. And it passed. They left. The front door closed behind them. I heard Kevin's car door shut with a kind of controlled violence. Not a slam, but close. I sat alone in the living room for a long time. The casserole was still on my kitchen counter. There was fear. I will not pretend otherwise. Not fear of them as people, but fear of what they were willing to do. The particular vertigo that comes from realizing that someone is not constrained by the same ethical limits you assumed applied to everyone. They had just told me, in a living room with Harold watching from his photograph, that they were prepared to invent things, to manufacture a version of my marriage and present it to a court, to use Harold's silence, the permanent, irreversible silence of the dead, as a weapon against me. But here is what I discovered in that room, sitting alone with the ticking clock and the unwanted casserole. The fear and the resolve were not opposites. They fed the same source. The fear sharpened everything, made the stakes legible and concrete and real. I knew, with a clarity I had not possessed before that morning, that I could not leave this unfinished. That to walk away now would be to confirm everything they believed about me. That I was manageable, that I was old, that I would eventually be tired enough to stop. I was not tired enough to stop. I called Patricia on Monday morning before I had even finished my coffee. They came to the house Saturday, I said. They threatened to introduce fabricated information about the marriage if the case proceeds. A brief silence. Then, good. Write down everything that was said, exact words where you can remember them, approximate words where you can't, with the date and the time. That conversation may become directly relevant. She did not sound alarmed. She sounded like someone who had just been handed a useful piece of evidence. I'll have it to you by this afternoon, I said. The hearing before the probate court was scheduled for a Thursday in the third week of February. Patricia had spent the preceding weeks building the presentation with the methodical patience of someone laying brickwork. Each piece placed deliberately, tested for stability before the next was added. Sandra Chu had agreed to testify formally. Her deposition had been taken the week prior, and I had read the transcript 3 times. She was precise. She had been a paralegal at Lyle & Associates for 11 years before leaving. She stated, under oath, that on the date Harold's will revision was executed, Kevin Mercer had been present in the office for approximately 40 minutes before Harold arrived, that he had been in conference with Robert Lyle, and that he had been the one to drive Harold to the appointment. She also stated that Harold had appeared, in her description, confused and deferential, that he had asked her once which room he was supposed to go to, despite having been to the office 3 times previously. Dr. Ewan's records documented, in clinical language, the early vascular dementia diagnosis, February of 2020. The will revision had been signed in April of 2021. 14 months. The capacity assessment in Lyle's file, which Patricia had finally obtained through formal discovery, was a single paragraph. It asked Harold 3 orientation questions and noted that he had answered all correctly. His name, the year, the name of the current president. It did not assess complex financial reasoning. It did not note the dementia diagnosis, which Lyle had not asked about. Patricia had obtained an expert witness, a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Miriam Aldis, who reviewed the medical records and gave a written opinion that Harold's testamentary capacity at the time of signing was, at minimum, substantially uncertain. We arrived at the courthouse on a gray February morning. I wore the blue wool coat again. Thomas was beside me. Dorothy had offered to come, and I had accepted. She sat in the gallery with the quiet solidity of someone who had been a friend long enough to require no instructions. Kevin and Diane were already seated with their attorney, a young man from Columbus named Brett Harland, who had the bearing of someone who believed that confidence was the same thing as competence. He had submitted a response brief arguing that the capacity challenge lacked foundation and that Sandra Chu's testimony was motivated by a personal grievance against Lyle's firm. The hearing began. Patricia presented the timeline with the economy of someone who had no need to embellish. The account opened in 2002. The will revised in 2021, post-diagnosis, with Kevin present. The inadequate capacity assessment. Dr. Aldis's expert opinion. Sandra Chu's testimony. Brett Harland's cross-examination of Sandra Chu was aggressive and, I thought, miscalculated. He pressed her on her departure from Lyle's firm, the disputed circumstances Dorothy had mentioned. Sandra met every question with the same steady composure. She had not left because of a personal grievance, she said. She had left because she had been asked to witness documents without reading them, and had declined, and had subsequently found her position untenable. That answer landed in the room like a stone in still water. The judge, a woman of perhaps 60, named Judge Carla Innes, who had the unhurried attention of someone very good at her work, wrote something on her pad. Then Brett Harland made what I can only describe as an error of overconfidence. He called Kevin to testify on a procedural point about Harold's regular functioning in daily life, an attempt to establish that Harold was capable and independent. Kevin took the stand with the composure of someone who believed he was better at this than he was. Patricia cross-examined him. She asked him to describe his relationship with Harold. He described it warmly. Close, trusting, a father-son bond. She asked how often he had spoken with Harold in the 2 years before Harold's death. Frequently, Kevin said, weekly. She asked whether Harold had ever discussed his financial arrangements with Kevin. Kevin hesitated. In general terms, he said. She asked whether Kevin had been aware, prior to Harold's death, of the individual savings account at First Federal Trust. A longer pause. Harold mentioned he had savings, Kevin said. She asked whether Kevin had discussed the will with Harold. Harold expressed his wishes to me, yes. She asked when those conversations had occurred. Kevin named a year. Patricia placed a document on the record. It was a phone log, obtained through discovery, showing that Kevin's calls to Harold's personal cell phone had increased from an average of twice monthly to an average of 8 times monthly in the 14 months between Harold's dementia diagnosis and the will revision. Kevin looked at the document. People talk more when someone is ill, he said. Yes, Patricia agreed, they do. She let the silence sit for exactly the right number of seconds. Judge Innes looked at Kevin over her reading glasses with an expression I could not have described precisely. Not hostility, but a very specific form of attention, the kind that means a decision is already forming. The hearing recessed for deliberation. In the corridor outside, I stood with Thomas and Patricia. Diane sat across the hall with Kevin, who had his elbows on his knees and was speaking to Brett Harland in a low, tight voice. Diane looked at the floor. She did not look at me. Is this what it feels like? I thought. To have told the truth loudly enough that it lands. Patricia touched my arm briefly. You did well, she said, which from her was equivalent to an ovation. Judge Innes issued her ruling 11 days later, in writing, delivered via Patricia's office on a Monday afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Patricia called. The same table where I had sat with cold coffee in October. The same chair, the afternoon light coming through the same window. Some things change, and some things hold still. The court has sustained the capacity challenge, Patricia said. The 2021 revision to Harold's will has been invalidated in its relevant portions. The bequest to Kevin and Diane Mercer of the individual savings account is void. I sat quietly for a moment. Your elective share claim, she continued, has been granted under Ohio statute. Given the length of the marriage and the size of the estate, the court has determined your elective share constitutes 100% of the augmented estate assets in dispute. The full account. I said, "Can you say that again?" She said it again. $847,000, plus the interest accrued during probate proceedings, which brought the total to just over $863,000. Patricia explained the rest with her customary precision. Robert Lyle had been referred to the Ohio State Bar for a disciplinary inquiry regarding the adequacy of his capacity assessment. Sandra Chu's testimony had been entered into the formal record and would be part of that inquiry. Kevin Mercer was not facing criminal charges. There was insufficient evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he had exerted undue influence as opposed to manipulative influence, which exists in a grimmer and more legally ambiguous register. But the civil record of the proceedings, including the phone log analysis and Sandra Chu's testimony, was now a matter of public record. That was not nothing. In fact, depending on Kevin's professional life, it was quite a lot. Brett Harland, I was told, had filed a notice of intent to appeal. Patricia advised me that the grounds for appeal were thin and that she was confident it would not succeed. She was not a person who used the word confident lightly, which meant something. I thanked her. I think I thanked her 3 times, which was probably unusual for her client interactions. She accepted it with a composure that I had come to understand was, for her, the equivalent of warmth. I called Thomas immediately after. He was still in Cincinnati. He had extended his stay twice now, and his employer was, I suspected, beginning to notice. He answered on the second ring. When I told him, he was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. A genuine laugh, surprised out of him. "Mom?" he said. "I know," I said. I know. Harold left you out, and you just walked into a courtroom and—" "Thomas," I said, "come for dinner tonight. I'm going to cook." He came. I made the pot roast Harold had always requested on his birthday, which I had not made since he died. The kitchen smelled the way it used to smell on good evenings, when the house was full and there was nowhere either of us needed to be. Thomas set the table and we ate and talked until nearly midnight. He told me he was going to call his daughter, my granddaughter Emma, who was 7 and who I had not seen since the previous summer, and arrange for her to visit in the spring. At some point after dinner, he looked at me across the table and said, "Are you angry at Harold for keeping all of it from you?" I thought about it for a long time. I was, I said. I think now it's more complicated than anger. I think Harold was afraid of something, maybe of losing control, maybe of his illness, maybe of Diane, maybe all of those. I don't think he stopped loving me. I paused. But I also think that love, without honesty, is only half of what it should be. Thomas nodded slowly. The appeal, when it came, was dismissed in its entirety 6 weeks later by the appellate court. The funds were transferred to my account in April. I did not spend anything for the first 2 weeks. I simply let it sit there, visible on my online banking screen, which I had finally learned to navigate with Thomas's help. I looked at it the way you look at something that took a long time to earn. Then I called Patricia and paid her bill, which was substantial and entirely worth it. Then I called my financial advisor, a person I had found on my own, through Dorothy's recommendation, without consulting anyone named Mercer. and I began making plans. Spring came to Cincinnati with the particular insistence it has in Ohio, as though making up for the length of winter with aggressive color. The redbuds on Sycamore Lane came out in the second week of April, and I walked past them on my morning walks, a habit I had started in January and had not broken, and thought, with some surprise, that I was happy. Not the muffled, functional happiness of someone managing grief. Something cleaner than that. Something that felt like the return of a self I had set aside for a while. I had made several decisions. The first was that I would stay in the house, which some people had suggested I sell. I would not sell it. I had lived there for 24 years, and I intended to live there until I decided otherwise, and the decision would be mine alone. I repainted the study, Harold's pale green, which had always felt like his room more than mine, a soft cream that I liked better. I gave his chair to Thomas. I bought a new armchair for myself, blue, positioned so that I could see the garden through the window. The second decision was Emma. My granddaughter came in May, as Thomas had promised, and she was 7 years old and in possession of opinions about everything and afraid of almost nothing. And she filled the house with an energy that I had forgotten a house could hold. We planted tomatoes in the garden together. We went to the Cincinnati Zoo, where she informed me at length about capybaras, which are, apparently, her current primary interest. We made cookies and ruined the first batch and laughed about it. Thomas came with her and stayed for 10 days. I went to Helen's grief group every Thursday, now as a regular rather than a reluctant first-timer. I had told the group, eventually, about the will and the account and the court proceedings, carefully, without identifying details. And their reactions had been what I needed, not shock, but recognition. Frank, the retired postal worker, had said, "You didn't let them rewrite the story." He was right. That was precisely it. Dorothy and I had lunch every other Tuesday at a Thai restaurant we had discovered together and now considered ours. In June, I booked a trip. Thomas's daughter Emma had said, with the directness of 7-year-olds, that she had never seen the ocean. I arranged for the 3 of us to go to the Maine coast in August, a cottage in Rockport, 2 weeks, no particular agenda. I had never been to Maine either. Harold had always wanted to go somewhere European on our one annual vacation, and I had agreed. Maine had been on my list, privately, for years. I paid for the cottage with money that was mine. As for Kevin and Diane, I know what happened because Cincinnati is not so large, and because Dorothy, who is connected to the social fabric of the city in ways that would astonish a casual observer, kept me accurately informed without editorializing. The public record of the probate proceedings, including the phone log analysis and Sandra Chu's testimony, had been picked up by a Columbus business reporter who was writing a broader piece on estate manipulation and elder financial abuse. Kevin was not named in the piece as having committed a crime because he had not been charged with one, but his behavior was described accurately using public documents. The piece ran in February. Kevin worked in commercial contracting. He had a business partner of 12 years, a man named Phil, with whom he had built a mid-sized operation in the Columbus market. Phil, I was told, had read the article. The partnership was dissolved by mutual agreement in March. Without Phil's connections and operational knowledge, Kevin's contracts began to thin. By summer, he had laid off 2 employees and was taking on smaller residential jobs. The house in Columbus, which they had refinanced for home equity during the legal proceedings, was now carrying more debt than it had before. Diane had not spoken to me. I did not expect her to. She was angry, and grief and anger, as Helen had said, can share the same house for a long time. Perhaps someday, years from now, when the edges of things had worn smoother, something would be possible. I did not count on it. I did not require it. What I required was a great deal simpler: to be honest, to be present, and to tend the life I had. In August, Emma stood at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean in Maine for the first time. She was wearing her red sneakers, which she refused to remove despite my gentle suggestion, and she let the cold water run over them and looked at the horizon with an expression of pure and total astonishment. "Grandma," she said, "it's so big." "Yes," I said, "it really is." I stood beside her at the edge of the ocean and felt, without sentimentality, that the story I was living had turned a page. Harold was behind me, not forgotten, not resolved into simplicity, but integrated. Part of the landscape of what had happened rather than an obstacle across the path. The page ahead was blank. I found I was looking forward to writing on it. I was 72 years old and a widow, and I had just been handed the most significant test of my life. Not in a courtroom, but in my own kitchen, deciding whether to open that folder. Deciding whether a woman my age, alone, grieving, had the right to demand the truth about her own marriage. She does, I did, and so do you. What I learned is this: trust is not the same as compliance. Loving someone does not mean surrendering your right to know what is true, and being old does not mean being finished. It means you have lived long enough to know exactly what is worth fighting for. The people who counted on my silence were wrong about me. Don't let anyone be wrong about you in the same way. If you had been sitting at that table, that folder in front of you, your hands already trembling, would you have opened it? Would you have fought even when fighting was exhausting and frightening and uncertain? I believe you would. I believe that is why you are still here, listening. If this story moved you, please leave a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart, for listening all the way to the end.